Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. I actually recorded this a couple hours ago and uploaded it and realized there was zero audio. So this is take two, and I'm a little frustrated with myself. Anyway, none of that is your problem. Let me get the PowerPoint loaded and we'll get started. So this is going to be one of actually two lectures I do. And this is going to be the wrap-up of what we started in class Thursday and Friday on the early history of psychology. And we did those things to one extent or another in all three classes. I'm going to pick up from the early approaches, structuralism, functionalism, Gestalt. If there's anything I missed from these earlier slides, let me know in class tomorrow. We can go over it. So there's this slide. There's this slide, rationalism and empiricism. And then the structuralists who tried to be like, make the human mind into the periodic table of the elements. The functionalists who asked the function, what is the mind used for, and the Gestalt who tried to be more holistic. There are two names you should know for structuralism: Wilhelm Wundt and Edward Titchener. We'll start with Wundt. Wundt is German, studied at the University of Leipzig, and he lived in the 1800s, deep background in medicine. In his era, he had a huge influence with a number of books and many important students, so he spawned a big following. It was in 1879 in Leipzig that he set up the first experimental psych lab, and so that would be the year that psychology is, quote, born as a science. That is Wundt there in a photograph with his lab equipment and some of his assistants. Wundt wanted to study consciousness, and he wanted to do it experimentally. So he wanted to take the kind of protocols and methods of the natural sciences and use something introspection, or what he called internal perception, to examine the conscious experience that people have. This, of course, means that you have the observing subject being the observed subject as well, so that's a conflict. Why he is important is that he's considered the founder or father of experimental psychology. And secondly, he establishes the first experimental psych lab, and he's the first to use psych as a science. He's explicitly using experimental methods. So they're all kind of three things together. He's probably the first person to actually call himself a psychologist. The criticisms of him are that he was cataloging sensations with no understanding of that. So, like, he has all this data, but for what purpose? And more importantly, that his method of data collection was unreliable and subjective. Introspection as a technique is not an objective measure of what's going on in one's head. So even at the very beginning of psychology, we see a fundamental tension that continues to this day, which is psych as a science. How do you scientifically study something like the mind? Titchener studies under Wundt, adopts many of his methods and his ideas, and he uses those same experimental methods that Wundt did. He comes to America, to that spot, which some of you may recognize as Cornell, in the beautiful town of Ithaca to the west of us, and he explicitly names his approach structuralism. So Wundt never actually called it that, but they get kind of lumped together. He calls it structuralism because he is studying the structure of our mental activity, and he wants to break down consciousness into its elementary parts, the sensations and thoughts we have. And so he would, for example, analyze the auditory sensations and break it down into tones and noises. So this, I think, is an example of somebody being tested for their auditory sensations at Cornell. There's a very interesting article from a magazine at the time, McClure's, talking about one of the first psych labs at Harvard that was set up by William James. And you can see them, they knew that they were trying to approach psychology scientifically, and that's from the 1890s. But James and John Dewey are the founders of a movement called functionalism, which was US based and was directly kind of counter to structuralism. Rather than ask what the elementary structures of the mind are, functionalists would ask, what do people do and why did they do it? What unified functionalists were those questions they asked. So they were unified by the types of questions they asked, not in the answers they gave or in their methods. James wrote a famous textbook in 1890 called Principles of Psychology, and this is a quote from it. Consciousness, then, does not appear to itself as chopped up in bits. It is nothing joined. It flows. A river or a stream are the metaphors by which it is most naturally described. In talking of it hereafter, let's call it the stream of thought, or stream of consciousness, or stream of subjective life. So their key criticism of the structuralists was, you can't break consciousness down into its elementary pieces. You have to understand it as an active thing, as a flow, as Buddy the Elf's friend in the mailroom used to talk about the flow. James is the one who coins the term stream of consciousness. And he would ask, what is the point of consciousness? How does consciousness help us survive in the environment? Like the structuralists, the functionalists didn't last that long either and were replaced by more sophisticated approaches. It was too vague. What is function? It had no kind of unity among the different functionalists. They had all these different kind of methods and approaches. But what was successful was their criticism of the structuralists. About the same time, in the late 1800s, a third group develops, also in Germany. They disagree with the structuralists as well along similar lines. And their most famous thinker was Max Wertheimer. And they were known as the Gestalt school. They said you can't break down consciousness without destroying it. You can only understand it as a whole. Their key saying is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. They, out of the three approaches, are the only one that kind of remain relevant, and we will talk about them again when we study perception. So here you see three angles and three kind of Pac-Man figures, and what the Gestalt thinkers would do is say, there's a triangle there. Even though it's not actually drawn, we perceive it, and that's an example where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Or here's another example. Is it a tree or is it a gorilla and a lion? So we do kind of use Gestalt principles when we talk about perception. And this would be an example of, the human as something greater than the sum of its parts. If you break us down into our constituent elements, there's nothing much to us. A little bit of trace elements like sulfur and chlorine and magnesium, mostly carbon and oxygen, but you could have all that stuff in a room and it wouldn't make a human. The way we are combined, the whole of us, is the living, breathing organism, is something much more complicated. The Gestalt psychologists have great theory, little data. They're, again, like structuralism, it's hard to study well in experiments, so they kind of die out as well. And so you see from these first three movements, they all suffer from similar flaws. They are, their approach is kind of unsound scientifically, and they are grappling with that problem of the mind is difficult to study in a scientific, objective way. Okay, I'm going to cut this off at about 10 minutes and post a second lecture in just a little bit. I'll see you soon. Bye.